Welcome to a Point San Pedro Coalition webinar, Winter Birds of San Pablo Bay. We have a few housekeeping items that we'd like to go over with you before we get started. And just so you know, the event is being recorded. There is closed captioning. If you have questions during the webinar, just enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them after the presentation is over in person. And this is a event at no charge. So if you would like to give a donation and support the Point San Pedro Road Coalition, or in this case, the Marin Audubon Society, we do welcome all donations. And now we're going to go right into the event. I'm Winifred Dejani, and I welcome everybody to a Wetlands Committee webinar. I feel so fortunate to have the San Pablo Bay at arm's reach with its beautiful wetlands and wildlife. And our committee, which I chair, works to conserve this precious resource and raise awareness about it. And that's why we're here tonight. We've hosted several webinars related to wetlands since 2020. And the good news is, if you weren't able to see them in person, they are recorded and available for your viewing on either the Point San Pedro Road Coalition website at sprcoalition.org or at YouTube. And to give an example, we had a webinar, Wetlands 101, last spring, and also Rich Cimino, who's here tonight, did a wonderful webinar about the Vox's swifts with some live footage of them going into the chimneys to roost, which they do annually on their migration. And tonight we are so happy and fortunate to have Rich Cimino back to tell us about the local birds out in San Pablo Bay right now as we're approaching winter. Rich has been birding in Northern California for 54 years, if you can believe that. So he has a vast wealth of knowledge and experience. He's the owner of Yellow Bird Tours, which takes people out birding in this country, outside of the country, all kinds of amazing discovery tours. And Rich also very generously gives of his time to Marin Audubon Society and takes tours for their members. He is also a very dedicated counter of the Vox's swifts when they come and roost in the autumn at the McNear Brickyard. And he also is currently monitoring great blue heron and grand egret rookeries along the San Pablo Bay area. So without further ado, I am very pleased to turn things over to Rich.
Well, thank you. I've got to do a share screen, and Al, are you going to help me on that so I can bring up the PowerPoint? Al is not listening. Okay, so let's do this. Full screen.
You should be able to use share screen yourself.
Yep, here I go. Very good. There we go. Very good. Thanks, Al. Well, hello, everyone. So you know who I am. I've already been introduced. We don't need to go through that twice. Al, on the sidebar, I would like to just be the only window open. Don't want to
check on that little symbol on the bottom. That looks like a little screen on the pedestal.
Okay. There we go. Good. And I'm going to get rid of you. Not that I don't like you. There we go. So we want to go back up a couple. Okay. I hope everyone sees what the first PowerPoint is. A couple buffle heads. I tried to complete the entire PowerPoint presentation tonight with my photos. So this photo here is taken not far from Andy's restaurant over there in the Loch Lomond Marina. And these are buffle heads. And this photo was taken in January. So this year, we're having a little bit slower migration, and someone is coming in my room here. Excuse me just for a minute. Thank you. So we haven't seen many buffleheads so far this year. Generally, there's some pretty good, what we refer to as rafts of ducks and mergansers and other diving birds in San Pablo Bay. A good place to watch them is obviously from the spit on the harbor for Loch Lomond, or you could go over to Target on the Bay Trail, and with a scope or a big good pair of binoculars, you could see quite a few ducks. They haven't arrived this year. This is a map of the flyways in northern North America. And as you can see with this rose color map here, the shaded in, many of our birds come from the very high Arctic, the Bering Sea, Chuk Sea, and through here. This is Nome, and Barrow's over here. Barrow is the furthest north city in the Western Hemisphere. And a lot of our birds that come down to the Bay Area, a number of the species migrate from Barrow and Nome and other spots in the in Alaska and the tundra, or off on the islands, as the case may be with ducks and geese. But a lot of our ducks nest in the potholes and small depressions in the tundra. We'll talk about that as we get into those photos. And they make their way into California. And one thing that's been going on, whoops, here we go. San Pablo Bay has many good birding areas. This is one of the field trips that I've led. This one is from, this might be Owen Poly Park, the entrance, or it may be the Bay Trail, that little park right behind the Harbor Master's trailer over there, where the boat launch is and the feeding, the fishing bait store is in that area. So we lead a lot of local birding trips.
Rich?
Yes.
Rich, if I could interrupt, there's a little problem with your microphone. So if you could speak a little louder, that would be helpful for everybody. Appreciate it. And move up on the screen a little bit because your head's half cut off. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. Is this any better?
Yes, that's better. Just speak up.
Yeah. But one of the things that I did want to talk about tonight is I just read a report from October 21st of this year. U.S. Geological Research Group, which is in Menlo Park, did a study on the length of time it took a number of species to migrate from the high Arctic down into the Central California and the Bay Area this year, 2021, was extended anywhere from 4 to 9 days, depending on the species, based on the fire conditions in Northern California. We had 68 fires just in Northern California, August, September into October. And a number of species of, for instance, geese would be one study group that they did, stopped at 2 different locations where they typically just fly through, and they stopped for up to 4 days because the smoke was so bad that they knew enough to stop and just settle down and not waste energy and calories and get into a fix with fires and smokes. Another set of geese actually flew higher than they've ever been known to fly. So a lot of these birds are tagged with geolocators, this new Modus type of chip device that's tagged onto the birds, and it accounts for their travels by sunlight, and it reports in quite a bit like a Doppler antenna onto a chip, and we can, the scientists can track birds and see where they're going and what they're doing. Some birds, as I mentioned a moment ago, actually flew over the smoke and came into the east side of California, where they typically don't come. And others, as I mentioned, actually just settled into water or off of Oregon and Washington and just waited it out. Um, so the fires that we witnessed this past summer into early fall was really an impact on a lot of our wintering birds and their migration timing that they've had. So some of our birds just haven't been noticed yet, haven't been seen in big volumes. I have called a few friends that live in the Central Valley, Sacramento Valley, that go to the wildlife refuges quite a bit. And they say that there's good numbers of ducks and geese, but they're staged in the wildlife refuges to the east of Highway 5. So the birds are here. They just haven't fully gotten down into the Bay Area yet. They may be resting. They may have had these additional time slots, timelines put on their migration, and they may be feeding and resting to have the energy to complete the rest of their migration. So I find that interesting. And that's a report that's just came out in High Country News. That's a bi-weekly newspaper of what happens in the Intermountain West, including the Bay Area, and I should say Pacific Coast. So that's where this report came out of. The report, once again, was done by the U.S. Geological Survey out of Menlo Park. So what are some of the birds that come down from these high reaches in the Arctic tundra? So here's a common bird for us, the northern pintail. We see quite a few in the winter months. And if you go into Nome in May, June, and July, you'll find thousands of these pintail ducks nesting along creeks, in prairie potholes, in depressions, in wherever there's a water source that's still. They'll find a spot, and the males arrive about 2 weeks before the females. They have their young, and they go into early August, late July, and then they start this long migration down into, as you can see here, the breeding areas are all in this brown. And the non-breeding areas, for instance, like just here into Northern California and the Northern Bay areas like Marin and Sonoma, Mendocino counties, we get the non-breeding birds. Some areas have year-round populations. I think these are very, very slim populations. But back to our county and back to what we're talking about tonight, we do get a reasonable amount of northern pintails on a normal year, normal migration. Gadwall duck is another one. You can see where a lot of our waterfowl uses the northern tip of the Western Hemisphere for nesting. And once again, this particular duck has a total different distribution during migration. As you can see, it's a very narrow band. They follow the Pacific. And then, of course, they just spread out in post-migration, October through probably, I would say, into April before they start their way back up. This particular species also nests in Greenland. Look at that. We probably don't see those birds. Those birds come down the Atlantic flyway and maybe head west into Middle America. But all through Alaska, all through the provinces of Alaska, Canada, into the Maritimes and into Greenland. Many, many miles of flight and the endurance that they go through to get to areas where they can get out of those long, long, cold, dry winters in the Arctic, but that's where they nest. Another bird that we see that is here year-round, but we're starting to lose the population. The National Audubon Society and Fish and Wildlife departments throughout the United States are concerned about the surf scoter. Surf scoter is a diving duck. It likes eelgrass beds, but it eats oysters and clams, any type of crustacean that they find in diving. I'm not so sure that they eat small fish. They very well may be, but here in Northern California, in our area, Marin County, and even into San Pablo Bay, there's some efforts going on to restore eelgrass and oyster beds. The Marin Rod and Gun Club, just across the bay from Loch Lomond, and is doing a restoration project with the Romberg Institute in Tiburon, and they have established some oyster beds across from the target in San Pablo Bay. There's another effort to establish eelgrass and oyster beds in the East Bay Regional Parks off of Point Mole to reestablish feeding grounds, not only for oysters and clams and other crustaceans that filter and clean the water, but also for these diving ducks for food sources. So a lot of that with commercial shipping, and of course in Point Mole, we had the whaling industry for 100 years. Just a lot of commercial activities and pollution that went unchecked until the 70s and 80s when we started enabling the Clean Water Act and all. So this bird is under pressure, and look at the narrow breeding areas it has. It's not as broad based as the last two species, the ducks, that were just so broad based for breeding, and of course the numbers are greater. So these guys, this particular species, the surf scoter, is limited into where it nests. You can see it's where it migrates and then where it winters along the coast. And our numbers have dropped. I can recall years ago seeing large rafts of surf scoters, hundreds at a time. And now if you get 30 or 40, you know, a 60% drop in the population, just on visuals, not with a scientific study, but just visual observations, the population has really gone down quite a bit. So this photo is off the far point of the spit for the harbor by Loch Lomond, out at the very point. In fact, I was out maybe 4 or 5 days ago, and there were 3 surf scoters, all males. Whoops, that's a wrong name. That should have been changed. Anyhow, this is a common merganser, and it has the same distribution, breeding and migration points that the red-breasted does, and it just has the wrong name. This bird here is a common merganser. We do see them in San Pablo Bay, and once again, look at that wide distribution. And of course, this particular bird, the common, does go inland more. So you just have to excuse that particular map. We'll get out of that quickly. There we go. Interesting how that happened. Anyhow, moving right along, the western grebe is another common bird in San Pablo Bay, and it has a cousin that we'll touch on here in a minute. But this is an intermountain bird. It's in the Great Basin, Eastern California, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, all the way into, this stretches it a little bit into Wisconsin. I'm not sure what the population dynamics there, but here it's quite common. If you were to go to the Marin Headlands, the first year birds stay in just west of the Golden Gate. You can see on a good year, maybe up to 1,000. I've heard accounts up to 10,000 of these birds just wintering there. And then some birds stay through the summer and don't migrate until the following year when they're reach an adult status. But the western grebe is, once again, an intermountain bird. It would be the Great Basin, tips on some of the high deserts, high plateaus in Utah, eastern Colorado, Wyoming. And it likes large bodies of water like reservoirs, where there's plenty of fish, maybe even where Fish and Wildlife from the various states plant a lot of fish. They'll stay in there and just eat and have a good time on large bodies of water. You'll see these birds like in Mono Lake, Owens Lake, Lake Tahoe in the summer. In the winter, they come to our coast. Here's its cousins. Let me go back one. So the western grebe has a different bill, has a different back and different plumage. And typically this is a winter bird. So the line doesn't go all the way through the eye and underneath the eye into the sublaural here, but it'll give you a look to take a quick look at that and then look at this bird. This is a different species. This is the Clarks. And the Clarks in the winter adopt this like plumage to the western grebe, and but this eyebrow The black line goes over, and it's a different neck pattern. You can see this bird has the gray back, and it's a little bit smaller bird. This particular photo at this angle isn't the best, but you can see they interact on their breeding range. Their migration is a little different. It goes into the Great Plains a little bit. Here's Nebraska and Kansas, and it finds itself down into Baja and the Sea of Cortez. So when you're looking, if you're walking, just taking a walk out around Loch Lomond or McNear Beach, China Camp, anywhere, even a walk out by Target on the Starkwater Bay Trail, you'll see both species, both the Clarks and the Western Grebe. Here's another grebe, pied-billed grebe. They're with us just about year-round, and they're always, for me anyhow, this photo is taken inside the Loch Lomond Harbor, and it is, I believe, a January photo. Pied-billed grebe, also a diver, and feeding on fish and crawdads and any type of crustacean that it might find when it dives. Fairly common, if not very common, year-round. This is an eared grebe in winter plumage. This is a recent photo. I just took this several days ago, and you can see the eared grebe. These birds aren't going all the way up into the Arctic. They use the Canadian providences. You can see they're breeding and even in eastern California, like Modoc County, Sierra County, Plumas County, all of these areas that have large reservoirs where there's a lot of storage, water storage. They migrate all the way through. You can find large concentrations of these birds in August, September, October, late September, in Mono Lake, which I believe is Tuolumne County on the eastern side of Yosemite. They'll get up to 20,000 birds at one time. These eared grebes, 20,000 of them in Mono Lake. And some shuffle down to Owens Lake. They're starting to have large migration populations in the fall also. And as you can see, this particular species goes all the way into Central America. We've got some of Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and maybe even further. But they have a total different migration. They don't use the northern half of the Western Hemisphere, but they go down into the subtropics, Central America, which is different than the Clark's grebe and the eared grebe, and they go much further. Excuse me, pied-bill. So this is let's go back one. There we go. So several species use this migration route, directing them into the winter areas of San Pablo wetlands and the open water. We also have a lot of pasturines. We'll touch on a couple of the sparrows that use the Loch Lomond area. But this gives you an idea of an overview without going into all the specific breeding areas. Once again, we have Barrel and Nome and Anchorage, and then follow the inside passage through British Columbia and Puget Sound, and then they start to slow down depending on what their needs are and spend their migration all through these areas that are in blue. So some of these birds are traveling 5,000 and 6,000 miles in one migration, maybe up to 12,000 miles a year. So some of the smaller birds, non-water birds, is the golden-crowned sparrow. And this bird comes from, as you can see, it will breed all the way up into Nome. We do see them in Nome when we have field trips up into that area. And larger, broader breeding grounds into the Northwest Territories, coming down into Washington, Oregon, and touches the Cascades and a little bit of the Sierras, and then they come into the Bay Area. So the golden-crowned sparrow is a winter resident, you might call it. It's here from anywhere from middle September to very late April, and some birds may leave sooner. The males typically always leave sooner because they have to find the prime nesting areas and territory claim and start singing, and a week to 10 days later, the females might follow, or the juvenile males, that what we call hatchier birds, that are just 1-year-old and may not be full breeding or have territories. They'll go up several days later, as I just mentioned, maybe up to 10 to 14 days, and go all the way back up. These little birds. This is probably a good backyard birder. If anyone listening tonight is a backyard bird feeder, you probably have golden-crowned sparrows in your yard this time of the year. White-crowned sparrows. Wow, look at this distribution for this little bird. So actually, the birds that we get into our Bay Area, into Marin County, don't really come from the eastern provinces of Canada. We might get 1 or 2 from the high prairie areas of Canada, like Saskatchewan and some of those territories. But we have like 4 different species of white-crowned sparrows. I'm not going to go into them all because they don't all count. They don't all use our Marin County during the winter, but we have 3 that do. And back to migration, the non-breeding birds year-round in the Sierras. Some birds nest in the Sierras and in the Cascades. And like the golden-crowned sparrow, they do an east-west migration in the September timeframe, and will stay with us into April. So if you're a backyard bird feeder, you for sure this time of the year have white-crowned sparrows. So we have a couple of types of white-crowns that come into Marin County, into the San Pablo Bay area. One comes all the way down from Puget Sound. And if you're not familiar with Puget Sound, it's in through here, and that's called the Pugetentia. And it's a little different than the Gambles, which comes from the Sierra. So these birds arrive in the September timeframe, have a little different color bill, have a little different plumage, and the primaries, their wings don't go all the way back into the tail area because they're not quite as long of a migration route. The Gambles, which has an oranger bill with a black tip, they have very long wing primaries, and they tend to hang down into the back of the bird. And the reason for that, their wings are larger, is they have a longer migration route to go. So we have a couple different types of white crowns. You can start looking at their plumage, you look at their bills. If you don't have a field guide, the National Geographic Field Guide, the 7th edition, does a very good call out on the differences of the birds. I think it's on page 510. In fact, I know it is. I look at it all the time. But they also have what I call good distribution maps, and they're referenced on that page. And they'll take you to the back of the book, and you can see the different specific migration routes for the different white-crowned sparrows, which we're not going to cover tonight. This is a Lincoln sparrow, and they like wet, boggy, moist, damp environments. And I've been tracking a pair, I think it's for 5 years now, that is in the Loch Lomond Bay Trail little side park next to the trailer where the harbor master is. There's some swells that have been planted there to capture waters when it floods. And as it is mentioned, for 5 years, I've had a pair consistently there in the fall. And that's where this picture was taken. This is a fall bird, Lincoln sparrow. And you can see, well, they don't quite get all the way up into the Arctic. They sort of end at the end of the spruce forest before the tundra begins, right about here. And they like the spruce forest. There's a lot of snow. There's a lot of dampness and ponds and wetness and mosquitoes and coffeeberry and other types of berry trees and insects that they use for food source. And then you can tell their migration during the winter. And then you can see how they winter in the Bay Area and along the coast down into Baja in Mexico. And this bird also gets into Guatemala. Lincoln sparrow. Some of the common birds that we see, I put up a couple more PowerPoints. The black oyster catchers, we have quite a family there out at the far point of the Loch Lomond spit, opening for the harbor. And there, any time of the year, you can always find up to anywhere from 1 to 7 of the black oyster catchers, and a handsome bird. And they seem to have gotten used to people. They don't take off too quickly. And these are black turnstones, and black turnstones have also gotten used to people and don't really fly off. So if you've got a camera and you're interested in photography, these are good steady birds. You can see their distribution all the way out on the Aleutian Islands, all the way down into Baja. Several years ago, maybe 20, maybe 25 years ago, I was part of the black oyster catchers survey teams along the West Coast, because there were certain groups, I think National Audubon was one, that wanted to have the black oyster catcher listed for endangered. So they thought the populations had really crashed and plummeted. So they had a lot of volunteers as well as scientists, ornithologists out doing surveys for, I think we did them for close to 5 years. And what they discovered just in California, into Baja, there were 20,000 of these birds. And that was just unknown. And with all these volunteers and professionals, we got into a lot of places that hadn't really been studied thoroughly and birded, and came up with that. So with those numbers and the other populations that they found Oregon through the Aleutians, they dropped the initiative to try to have it listed as an endangered species. Black-bellied plovers and turnstones are common winter visitors. The black turnstones and the black-bellied plovers, as you can see, they nest very high in the Arctic, all into here, all of northern Canada, all of these provinces. And they migrate through, these are their migration routes. And then they winter anywhere from British Columbia down into Baja. We can find them. This eastern population comes through the Maritimes and comes around the Gulf of Mexico into the Caribbean and finds their way into northern South America. Our birds come through California. We have large populations of these. Not to go too far off, but some of the largest populations in California are found in Hayward. And the Christmas bird counts, which will be coming up, have some really large numbers, thousands of black-bellied plovers that use the Hayward shoreline in Alameda County for their wintering grounds. And then we have our own numbers. I'm not sure they're that high, but Christmas bird count, they're always an active bird on the Christmas bird count. Excuse me for doing that. So these birds, if you will, these species are traveling 4,000 miles one way, 8,000 miles from Barrow and Nome down into the Bay Area, into Baja, and even further. This is their winter plumage. They're sort of nondescript. They lose all of those beautiful bright feathers, and they're just gorgeous birds in the spring and summer when they're in their breeding plumage. Well, all of our birds that we've seen tonight. I've done everything this evening in winter plumages when it fits. So if any of you go out and start birding on your own or taking a walk along the shoreline, you'll be focused on these drab colors rather than looking for breeding birds, which a lot of them we don't see in the winter. This is one bird that is really different. It's the least sandpiper. Its breeding plumage, when it will leave here in April, will have a lot of chestnut, just a gorgeous bird. During the winter, it just loses all of those chestnut colors. It has its yellow legs. It's different than a Western sandpiper. These are what people refer to as peeps. There's several different species of peeps, and this is the peep word is a descriptive catch-all for small sandpipers that basically the non-birders can't tell apart. So they're just a peep. If you're a bird watcher, you get into these little droopy bills, you get into these wide faces at the bill, you get into leg color, you get into supercilium or eyebrows, eye color, length of the tails, wings, scapulars, you really go crazy. But if you're just a person that's out walking and wants to enjoy nature, and you see a flock of these doing their choreographic flight, there might be 500 or 600 birds, maybe 1,000 birds, or it can be as few as 50 birds, but they'll catch your attention and maybe you'll get interested in bird watching. Wandering Tattler. This was taken in the boat harbor. This is several years old. I haven't seen this bird back. Sometime I have looked for it. It's a high Arctic mister. We don't get many in the bay, but they do come in. Great blue heron and the great egret are using the San Pedro wetlands for feeding and nest in the Bell Marin Keys to the north of our area, maybe just 2 or 3 miles of flight, but maybe 4 or 5 miles if you had to walk it. And of course, you just take 101 up to Bell Marin Keys, exit there. And if you follow the road along, you'll see a large grove of eucalyptus. It's a also an entrance point, public parking as part of the Bay Trail. Again, you'll look for signage. And Janet and I, my partner and I, Janet actually is the lead. She and I volunteer for Audubon Canyon Ranch in Bolinas. And for the last several years, we've been surveying and counting the nests. We had a good year, I believe it was 2019. We had 72 nests, which means 144 adult birds. And the nests can have up to 3 young. More often than not, 3 hatchlings don't always make it, typically maybe 1 or 2. But you can see the population of this bird is very, very healthy in Marin County. And I've seen photos of residents in the Loch Lomond area along San Pedro Road that have up to 100 of these birds in their photos, 75, just large concentrations of great egrets in the area, blue herons also, and snowy egrets. So the Bell Marin rookery, as I just mentioned, can have up to 72 nests, 2019. The great egrets build a nest of sticks. We start surveying in April, and there's a lot of adults, both male and the females, are carrying sticks and building nests. Some nests make it through the winter and they're ready to go. This winter, we've had a lot of strong winds and might be a little different, might be a lot more nest building. Last year, 2020, one of the eucalyptus was decayed in the center and strong winds came to knock it over. So this year's nesting numbers were quite a bit less. They lost about 1/3 of their available nest sites in that one tree that came down. But it's always active, and it's interesting because a pair of red-tailed hawks nest in the same trees. They don't seem to bother the egrets. And this past year, 2020-21, we had a pair of great horned owls that had 3 young that nested right in the heat of it all, right in the traffic with all the egret nests around them. And the owls nest earlier, as you know, they start in January. But we had 3 large baby owls all the way into the May timeframe. And then one day we appeared to finish counting, and all the owls were gone. But as far as we can tell, they're not predating on the juvenile, the hatchling great egrets. They just use the same eucalyptus grove for nesting, and there's a lot of farmland. There may be more rodents, mice, voles, maybe even rats, maybe neighboring cats, whatever, but they're not using the egret rookery as a food source. This is an interesting bird. Many of you maybe knew about it. Maybe you even went to see it. It's a little blue heron, which is different than the great blue heron, which is our resident bird. This is a southeast bird, and I'll have a distribution map. I hope, yeah, I do, in a moment. So this bird was spotted by one of the residents near the target area, target facility, and she reported it on one of the rare hot bird lines, an eBird, which is a social media site for reporting birds and your birding activity. And this bird was really way out of its even migration territory. So here's where it migrates and breeds, and here's its winter grounds. And you can see Baja is about it for us. And we had this one bird come all the way up to the Bay Area, 2018, 2019, and it stayed around for several months. And bird watchers that like to have checklists and see different species, different states, different counties, or just life lists, a lot of different ways we record birds, came from all over the Western United States to see that bird in California. Pretty interesting. So this is me. I want to thank all of you for supporting the Wetlands Committee and attending tonight. I've been introduced. I don't have to tell you who I am. Got a little introduction earlier from Winfrey about my local tour business, birding business. And we do tours throughout North and Central America, France and Italy. I do specialize field trips to find condors in Central California and the Monterey Bay. And also I lead field trips for the Morro Bay Birding Festival, which is coming up in January. And we'll do beginning bird classes in your backyard or local park. My phone number is up there. And I'm an Audubon Society volunteer, and it was mentioned earlier, I'm one of the, that's a survivor, it should say. Anyhow, I didn't catch that little, oops. I do the swift bird, boxes swift counts throughout the summer. And so this is us. We have a field trip going out into New Mexico on May 12th. And we start in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Taos. It's a 5-day trip, and it includes birding, cultural. We bird in and out on Native American properties, and the Taos Pueblo is there. And Santa Fe, we do a lunch and dinner in the Gallery Road with a lot of the art galleries and all. And then we do some birding in the upper canyons of Santa Fe. So that's me. And I see we have some questions, or at least a question.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. Thank you, Rich. That was very interesting. I particularly loved hearing about all the different birds in the rookery, the herons and the owls and the red-tailed hawks, and how they just all go in there and, you know, get along, and the raptors don't prey on the herons. So yeah. And it's an amazing time of year to go out. I know on the breakwater on the harbor, I'm seeing some of those very birds that you talked about now, a few of them, but yeah. And so we do have some questions. We have a little time for questions. If anybody has questions that they want to put in the Q&A. But one of the questions we have is, when you speak of non-birding birds, do you mean ones that are too young? Non-breeding birds?
Right. So certain species have different cycles. For instance, the condor goes anywhere from 3 to 5 years before it's capable of breeding. And something that the ornithologists are beginning to discover, if they do begin breeding in that 3 to 4 year cycle, typically their eggs don't hatch. They don't have an embryo in them, but they get started and they learn the process. And then of course, other birds, for instance, I didn't cover them because we don't get many of them, but we have Pacific loons and common loons and redneck loons that stay a full year in Drake's Bay on Point Reyes before they, so they come down, what we call a hatch year bird. They were born in year 2019. They spend year 2020 in Drake's Bay, part of Point Reyes National Seashore. And then in 2021, they take off and they go to the high Arctic, and either they made up or they spend a year trying to figure out what they just did and learn the process, come back down, and then the following year. So a lot of the larger birds aren't ready to begin that process until they're a little bit older. But then, you take birds, for instance, like our sparrows that we hit photos of, they're ready to go the next year. Now, part of that is because, they're a food source for Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks and other predators. So they begin their mating at a much younger age.
Okay, interesting. So they just kind of hang around to learn, how to do what they need to do. They're just
right.
part of the group, but not really fully aware yet.
Yeah, and some of these birds, like the eared grebe, that does, I believe it's a 12,000-mile round trip migration every year. There's a big attrition factor every year of birds just dying. So they nest early in their life also, because they have to constantly replenish the population. And because of these long migrations, birds just die of fatigue. And
Yeah. Must be hard to get enough food to make that long journey. Here's another question. It's a little far afield of what you're discussing tonight, but can you tell us about the pelicans and otters at Abbott's Lagoon?
Well, so otters are sort of top of the food chain for the Bay Area and the aquatic food chain. I guess mountain lions would be the top of the food chain on land. And the otters are a predator, and they're part of the ecosystem, and they are family community hunters. Recently, I observed with one of my friends, quite by accident, we didn't plan this, but on Abbott's Lagoon, we found 3 river otters that all 3 were in Abbott's Lagoon. And there were a number of young pelicans, and 2 of the otters were just sort of harassing the pelicans, and another otter came in, grabbed one by the legs, took him under and drowned it. And we followed it for a short way. It was dragging the bird to its den, and then we didn't want to disturb it because that's all part of the ecosystem. So we went off and did what we were doing, some birding, and we came back a little bit later, sort of knew where to go and found the den, and we found 14 carcasses there. Those otters have been having a good source of protein. They were doing what they're supposed to do, and that's keep the pelican population at bay, I suppose. But also that same type of events have been witnessed and videoed, I think, on Rodale Lagoon in Marin County, part of the Golden Gate Recreation Area. So that's pretty common. I have here, we live on Corte Madera Creek, and catty corner from our house, we're on the creek. There's a spring, and with very, very low tides, you see fresh water coming out of percolating out of the earth. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I saw there was a family of otters. There were what I think were 2 adults and a juvenile. And one of the adults and one of the juveniles just stayed on the mud. And one of the otters dove in this spring, this artesian well that was percolating. Dove in, I don't know how long it stayed, but it did. It came up with a huge fish. It bit the head off of the fish, rested the body to the other adult with the young one, and they began eating that. And the otter that dove ate the head of the fish. And so, they're just skilled predators. They're living in the environment that they're supposed to. And it may seem tragic, that they're such skilled hunters, but there's a whole balance there, and we just accept them as a value versus a negative. And, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I guess the flip side of that would be an otter not having enough food and starving.
Yeah.
So
A
yeah.
piece of information just came to my mind. I was reading something, um, and the DNA on the otters that we have in Corte Madera Creek. Um, maybe 30 years ago, we didn't have otters here. And then all at once they started appearing. And so uh, Fish and Wildlife did a study and they got some DNA. And I think they believe that these otters in the Corte Madera Creek and the Marin Water District watershed of Mount Tam came from Solano County because there's another
Mm.
population there,
Mm.
match DNA. So this population is no different than any other wild population. You know, it gets overburdened a particular area, and other strong alpha males and females go off.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a bit like coyotes or
Mm-hmm. Wolves.
yeah, any of the
Yeah.
top predators.
Yeah.
When you get an alpha male or an alpha female,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to go off on their own and get a territory. So I read that and I thought that was very interesting because
Mm.
it isn't like this was a separate species that no one knew about, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
all at once started to repopulate. So
Mm-hmm.
these otters that we have in the Marin Water District watershed, including where we live here, came from Solano County.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Someone wants to know if there's an easy-ish way to tell the difference between a red-tailed and red-shouldered hawk.
Well, so the red shoulder is always going to be calling, it seems like, and they have a very distinct different call. And they're just two different birds. The red-shouldered hawk is just that. It's red-shouldered. It has a lot of variegated black and white and red feathers. It's smaller. One way to find them is they're typically on a telephone wire looking down into a wet area. They do eat aquatic food sources like crawdads and snakes and frogs, as well as mammals. The red-tailed hawk is a bigger buteo. It's going to have larger shoulders. It's going to have more of a brown back. It will have a red tail. The red tails are sort of go from very light when they're a juvenile bird to very dark when they're an adult bird. They have a chest band. Um, so, you know, those are sort of the most easiest ways. But, you know, I'm so used to looking at them that that may sound difficult for other people. But there's some real simple ID marks. A good site to go online is All About Birds. It's sponsored by Cornell University, All About Birds. You can go in and type red-shouldered hawk, and it'll tell you all about it and give you some really fantastic photos. Or you can go in and type in red-tailed hawk, and it'll do that for you also.
Okay, great. Two more questions. The next one I think I can answer, which is, does the Point San Pedro Road Coalition have an ID posting of photos and names of all the birds that visit the nearby bay? Well, we do have a posting, not of all the birds, but a lot of the more commonly ones seen, and it is under the tab of wetlands under local birds. And we pulled that up on the website, put that up on the website last year. So a lot of your most frequently seen birds, you can see them there. You can read a little blurb about them, and then it will connect you through to Marin Audubon, who has a much more comprehensive archive of all the birds. So it's a good introduction. So we don't have all of them, but we have the most commonly seen ones, and Audubon has a wealth of information and a wonderful app too that I use a lot to identify birds. Someone's here is concerned that the swallows at China Camp seemed far fewer this summer than in previous years. Do you know anything about that, Rich?
Well, here on Corte Madera Creek, we had just a big population explosion of cliff swallows, more than we've ever seen.
Huh.
Janet and I followed them closely, and we think that they had at least two nesting broods. And the one on our house, we believe, had three nesting broods and went all the way into September.
Mm-hmm.
and they arrive early.
Mhm.
And they enjoy being around water. For one thing is, they make mud nests. So
Mm.
low tides are busy getting mud in their bills and building
Mhm.
nests. And of course, insects hatch
Mhm.
in the various vegetation along the creeks. I don't know so much about China Camp. I know a few years ago we were doing great blue heron nest surveys um, along behind China Camp in the foothills there. And we had quite a few violet green
Hmm.
swallows. We had tree swallows in good numbers. I honestly didn't bird China Camp area this year,
Mm.
so I can't really answer that.
Mm.
It just may have been just oddly that they picked other areas to go to, but I think
Yeah.
we had all good numbers. We have on our housing development, we have fountains as you come in, and the swimming pool is there, and there's some substrate. We even had northern rough-winged swallows nesting in that area, and that's sort of uncommon. So
Yeah.
here, 5 or 6 miles from where you are,
Right.
we had just the opposite.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Well, okay, that's it for the questions. I want to thank you, Rich, very much. This was really so interesting and informative, and your information, all of your knowledge is just invaluable to us that live in the area. So thank you, and also I want to thank everybody who attended this evening. And I really appreciate your taking an interest in our wetlands and supporting the coalition by attending this. And now you can leave with some additional insight about your local feathered friends. And maybe you'll take that a little bit further.
Right. Yeah. It's fun. The fun thing about birding is if you like to travel, you can take it everywhere with your pair of binoculars.
Yeah.
Field guides, all the field guides are on your phone now. You can just subscribe to them.
Yeah.
And you don't have to carry a book, just binoculars. So.
And there's always something new to learn. There's different birds wherever you go. That's what sort of happened to me. So you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you,
Well,
everybody.
thank you, everybody, and
Good night.
enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye. Are we off now, Al? I guess we're off. I think it went pretty good. How many people did we have?